Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. This is episode number 289. I am your host, Eric Worrell, and today we're going to be talking about Newton's third law and why I think it applies to the real estate markets and different kind of restrictions that you're seeing being placed on landlords and in not only the U.S., but outside of the U.S. as well. We're going to be covering a lot of recent stories from 2019 and what the fallout is and why Newton's third law applies here. So we're going to get to that right after this.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
Now, I don't want to get too heady on today's podcast because I don't want to lose people because I'll probably lose myself as well. But I looked up, got on the old Googles and looked up Newton's third law just to make sure I had it correct. But Newton's third law is basically for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. I know I've touched upon this on podcasts in the past, at least the concept of it without directly naming it, but I wanted to just do an episode dedicated to it because I was looking up content, and typically what I'll do is I'll look up content that's trending in the last week to get ideas for the show. And I started reading one and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. I'm surprised I didn't hear about any of this. Turns out it was actually in Britain, so that made sense. But it kind of made me realize that Britain's kind of going through a lot of the same things that we're going through in the United States, where you see actions happen, whether it might be restrictions that are placed on landlords or new regulations that are handed down, and then there is an equal and opposite reaction. So how about I read you some of this Forbes article to kind of give you an idea of what's happening over there, and then relate it to things that I've seen happening in the United States and Canada, and seeing how that there is this similar kind of connecting thread of Newton's third law. So the article comes from Forbes.com, and the title is Supply and Demand, The Leaking Ship of Landlords and Tenants by Gary Barker. So I'll try to summarize some of this, but what Gary said is that he prophesized that the industry was going to have an issue, and he did this about 6 months ago since the government enacted something called the Tenant Fees Act on June 1st. And again, this is in UK, United Kingdom. Reports have steadily been coming in that rents have been on the increase as more and more landlords are choosing to exit the market. So he said, it's a little comfort to see my earlier prediction take shape, as this is the one thing I would have loved to be wrong about. But the writing was on the wall from the get-go that the burdens being levied against property agencies and landlords would have detrimental knock-on effect to tenancies in both cost and supply. So opening up his earlier prediction, he was talking about rules and regulations, what agents and landlords need to know. So what happened in the United Kingdom was that tenant fees bans play on June 1st, 2019, and it aims to ensure that tenants will be able to see at a glance what a given property will cost them in the advertised rent with no hidden costs. That means that deposits will be capped at 5 weeks rent or 6 for tenancies that cost more than $50,000 a year, and agents and landlords will be banned from charging fees for anything other than contract changes, council and utility taxes, changes to tenancy, and issues for which the tenant is at fault. The tenant fees ban is set to affect both landlords and agents who won't be able to pass on the cost of activities such as inventories, tenant referencing, and credit checks to tenants. So if you're a landlord who lives in New York State or Minnesota, specifically Minneapolis, or other areas that have recently had regulations handed down, this may sound kind of familiar. So for example, in New York State, you cannot look at eviction data anymore. They handed down that you cannot charge more than $20 for a background check, and there's a lot of other regulations that have been handed down. In Minnesota, I covered this on, I believe, episode 274, actually 263, Minneapolis landlords pushback. So what happened out in Minneapolis is they're putting restrictions on not being able to look at criminal data and also not being able to just deny somebody if they had below a 500 credit score. What I brought up on that episode was that it was kind of interesting in the fact that what landlords were doing, at least it's rumored doing, is that a lot of them were just increasing their rents there as well, or they were making it harder to get the apartment because you had to have an even higher credit score or something like that. What I've found in a lot of these cases, all right, and here's another one. Episode 274, we talked about New York City micro apartments exposed. So this is where somebody was turning all these apartments into micro apartments. But another thing that we've heard about is that in New York City, due to the rent control laws that went into place, that a lot of apartments were moving people to different apartments and then rezoning apartments. So they'd take two rent-controlled apartments that were next to each other, knock the walls down, and then create a new apartment that was rent-controlled. And what they were doing is they were pushing people out of, or at least incentivizing them out, and actually reducing the amount of rent-controlled units that were on the market. Another example of Newton's third law in a case study, and I've talked about this recently, is California recently instituted rent control, but they did not get the 2/3 majority vote that was required to make it happen immediately. So what happened in California was, I think it was a 90-day delay, don't quote me on that, but like 3-month delay when the announcement came down to when it was actually implemented, which actually just happened recently. When I was talking to Steve, he was telling me that he got an email from the NAPBS, National Association of Public or Professional Background Screeners. So what happened in that instance is that a lot of these landlords felt like they had a 90-day window. So what they did is they jacked up the rents in a lot of situations where they thought the rents were going to be controlled soon. So, and the shocking thing is that the tenant advocacy programs were shocked that this happened, which seemed a little naive to me in that situation. So again, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. I'm not saying the reactions are correct or right. But I'm saying that when these regulations are handed down, it's naive to think that there isn't going to be a reaction. So going back to the original story about what's happening in the UK, what they said is that they found, and they call them letting agents, right? That's just like real estate agents who are doing tenant placements. It said that the latest private rental sector report from ARLA Property Mark reveals that nearly 6 in 10, 58% of letting agents have seen an increase in rent in September. And this is up from 31% of agents back in the September of the previous year. So nearly double the amount of rents went up. And why that's happening in the UK, according to this article, is a lot of restrictions are starting to be handed down and placed on landlords. So what are landlords doing? A lot of them are saying, I don't want to be a landlord anymore, and they're selling their property. Well, it's not always landlords that are purchasing the properties. A lot of times it's home buyers. They're seeing actually more and more home buyers in the UK. If I scroll down, I think I can find the stat here. It said that nearly 64% of households are owner-occupied as of 2018. But this is a drop from 9.9% registered in 2008. But it said that the last 10 years of steadily increasing house prices and dwindling supply following the recession have forced potential buyers to stay within the rental market. That puts a squeeze on rental demand, which in turn drives up prices further. So you're just kind of seeing he talks about that demand can't fly through a supply bottleneck. So the supply of rentals in the UK is diminishing even further due to restrictions being placed on landlords who no longer want to be landlords. And what you're seeing is that these restrictions that were handed down to help renters, making sure they're not getting gouged when they're applying for rental properties, or maybe there are these exorbitant fees being placed on them to run a background check or something like that. And now the reaction, Newton's third law, is that you are actually seeing rents go up because demand, or the supply of rental properties, is going down as people are jumping ship because they don't want to be landlords anymore. If I'm being honest 100%, when I sold my rental property, it definitely factored in a little bit, where I was looking at what was happening in New York State with all the regulations being handed down. And not that was like even more than like a few percent maybe of the decision of why I decided to sell, but it definitely factored in the back of my mind where it's like, okay, it's getting harder and harder to manage this property, so I'm going to sell. And in my case, I sold to an owner-occupied landlord where I took essentially 2 units that used to be in the market in North Buffalo where my rental was, and then it just reduced to 1 unit. So you could say in that particular case that you were removing one potential rental property, or rental unit, I should say, out of the market in that particular case. And if the reasoning I did that was specifically due to the New York State regulations, you could make an argument for that. So that's a pretty weak argument, I'll admit, on that case. So I thought it was interesting, and I was curious about Newton's third law and how it applies to human behavior. So I did some Googling and found this pretty cool website, behavioraleconomics.com. The title of this piece is called The Three Laws of Human Behavior by Aline Holsworth. And she specifically talks about Newton's three laws, and she lays the third law out, and she talks about if you were to take his third law, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, but look at it through the spirit of behavioral economics, basically human behavior, how would these three laws apply? And she says that basically law number 3 is that for every decision made, there are trade-offs and the potential for unintended consequences. I think that really puts the button on what I'm trying to say here, is that for every decision made, there are trade-offs and the potential for unintended consequences. So in the case of California, the decision made was rent control, but there are trade-offs and potential for unintended consequences. The unintended consequences was that the rent control was not introduced immediately after the bill passed, and the gap in time that was created an unintended consequence of landlords increasing rents or evicting renters or making drastic changes to try and improve their financial situation before rent control went into place 3 months later. Now, again, forgive me if it wasn't exactly 3 months. I'm kind of going from memory on there. They go into a little bit more detail on this, and I'll link to both the Forbes article and this behavioral economics article along with previous podcasts that I'm mentioning on this episode. But it said that trade-offs, it says that there are costs and benefits attached to every decision. We may actively weigh the pros and cons of a decision at times, and other times we may not. But regardless of our attention to trade-offs inherent to any decision, there are often losses suffered in one area when gains are made in another. For example, when you say you're considering starting a multivitamin, you might say, sure, it may very well be a placebo, but what are the downsides? Well, the cons could be that you're taking a multivitamin, which costs money, and she kind of goes down a rabbit hole here and explains how those costs can add up. But the concept of what are all the things I'm giving up if I do X is known as the opportunity cost. And I'm sure you've heard of opportunity cost before. And it's a type of trade-off that we often ignore. One way to weigh trade-offs like these is to classify the potential pros and cons of a decision and then weigh them, a method called signal detection theory, written by Daniel Ariely. When situations are complex and involve a degree of uncertainty, we can use this method to consider the trade-offs of a particular decision. Because our time and resources are limited, we have to choose how to spend them wisely. So it's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, and then it talks about unintended consequences. It says that they are related to trade-offs, just like the pros and cons of every decision that we don't see. There may be some unanticipated effects caused by the decision. When making a decision, we may not predict future effects that negate or undermine the positive aspects of that decision. A classic example of this is crowding out or over-justification effect, where a positive behavior like exercise is initially boosted with an extrinsic incentive. So, for example, a financial reward. But that positive effect disappears and may even retreat to a level lower than before the incentive was introduced. As soon as the incentive is discontinued, rewards like this can increase behavior in the short term, but undermine the motivation in the long term. Now, I don't know if you follow the same train of thought as me on this, but like I think of Section 8 in that a little bit, right? Because they're always kind of tweaking and thinking about how to introduce Section 8 and how to make that program work. And I think that going through this article would be a really good read for policymakers before they hand down a policy, because a lot of times they may not be thinking about all the unintended consequences, which is hard to do because they're unintended. But knowing that there is a reaction for a lot of this. I'm not a guy who pretends to have the answers, but I do think it is interesting to make the connections and start seeing how regulations and policy changes have these unintended consequences, and it kind of approaches that Newton's third law, and even seeing it playing out in other countries where you're seeing regulations handed down in the UK, and that the rental supply is getting even lower because of it, and that rents are getting jacked up, and the entire reasoning for these regulations was to help renters, and it may actually be hurting them by increasing rents. And we've talked about this before too, where there are some people who argue that rent control actually hurts the economy in that market because people who want to perhaps build new buildings, maybe they were planning on building an apartment complex, say they don't want to do it. And they said that, I remember reading this in Oregon where they had rent control. I think that might have been the first state that did it, that they had to kind of put certain provisions in there thinking about people who might be new builders, who might do some new construction, and trying to give them incentives that the rent control wouldn't apply to them in the same way because they were worried that people wouldn't want to build there. So what happens when new construction doesn't happen, new apartments complexes don't go up in your state? Well, there are then, again, less rentals. And when there are less rentals, there's less supply. And when there is less supply, and the demand outweighs the supply, rents go up if they can, if you don't have rent control in there. But you kind of get the idea. And landlords then have more power because the supply is so high, the demand is so high and the supply is lower. So it's an interesting conundrum. Definitely takes a lot of thinking to think of all the unintended consequences that may come from Newton's third law. And again, don't claim to have the answers, but I think it's stuff worth thinking about before policymakers kind of jump to conclusions and think that they're doing the best thing for landlords and tenants, that they may have some unintended consequences. So, if you're in a state where you're seeing some of this coming to fruition, I'm sure you can rationalize with it. And if you're not, it's only a matter of time, right? There will always be changes. Things will always be changing in the future. So it's stuff to think about and be aware of as you're even seeing it happening across the pond. But before I go on another tangent, I'm going to let you guys go this week. But appreciate you guys listening. And let me know what you think. Hit me up in the Facebook group or on in the email, eric@rentprep.com. And appreciate you guys listening. And I hope you have a great week and take care.